Well, welcome back to the show. We're talking about the politics of waste disposal. Some developing countries like Malaysia say they will no longer be dumping grounds for plastic waste. We continue now with our panel, and I want to start with you, Kate. Something that you mentioned earlier on, and that is new technologies that may or may not be being developed to get rid of waste without having to transport this waste all over the world. I mean, we have to accept the fact that the planet produces mountains of waste every day. Where are we in terms of developing technologies to process this waste?
Well, I think we're at a number of different stages. If you look at what's been happening in the United States over the past year, the recycling industry and various other industries have been stepping up to the challenge and saying, okay, now's the time we start developing better capacity at home, new technologies. And we see a lot of exciting developments, such as chemical recycling, that are still kind of expensive and hard to scale up. But I do think that in our context, there are ways that this can be done. I do think that we face a much larger global challenge. As you mentioned, the fact that mountains of waste are accruing all around the world and not just in the developed countries to be shipped to developing countries has created a massive problem that the international community needs to think differently about than it has been, because so far we're not seeing viable solutions to this problem on that scale.
Right, Bridget, how much of an environmental and health problem is this, say, for a country like Malaysia?
Well, the fact of the matter is we don't really know, given the fact that many of these things have really only come to the surface relatively recent under the government that was elected about a year ago. But what we do know is that so far is that it's been quite serious in terms of health implications, as well as having environmental spillovers into the water, into the land, affecting the agricultural sector. So there are clearly indications that this is actually much more serious than we've recognized and we've acknowledged in the past.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One other question, and that is, what does Malaysia do with the waste? Does it process it? Does it recycle it? Does it burn it?
Well, what's been happening traditionally is that they recycle, but because there's been so much of it, they've been burning it. And so this has created high levels of toxicity in the environment around many of these villages where people have been complaining about these problems.
Dinyar, Godrej, another big problem is the disposal of electronic waste. This is known as e-waste. European countries have been shipping large quantities of this waste to a West African country, Ghana. There is a dumping site there known as Agobobloshi. It's a mountain of electronic waste right down there. What do you know about that?
Well, I can't speak specifically to the Ghanaian example, but this kind of export has been going on for years, not only to Ghana, but to other African countries as well. And, you know, only about 20% of it is sort of formally registered. A lot of it goes on in the, under the pretense of sending reusable or second-hand goods to these countries when it's actually waste. Now, if you look at the situation there, where people are dealing with this huge amounts of waste. In 2016, it was estimated that the amount of e-waste that the world is generating is equivalent to 4,500 Eiffel Towers. So if even a fraction of that is going to these African countries where it's being dismantled, you know, without any sophisticated processes, industrial processes, exposing people to all kinds of hazardous materials. A lot of the stuff that can't be reused is getting burnt. You know, it's scandalous and it's crime, and it's a crying shame, a waste of resources, really. So, you know, there's that mantra, which we all know, reduce, reuse, recycle. I think we focus far too much on recycling, whereas most of it tends, or quite a lot of it tends to be downcycling rather than actual recycling. And it's time we woke up in the Western world to reducing, reusing, you know, making producers take back things and reuse them, refashion them. So those are the challenging environmental questions. And of course, it's a question of justice between the rich and the poorer worlds.
Kate O'Neill, the United Nations is reporting that 50 million tons of electronic waste, or e-waste, is being disposed each year, and that this volume could increase threefold by 2050. How big a problem is this going to be for us if nothing is done about it now?
Yeah, it is a big problem, and I think that this is a really good example of saying, well, it's not just a north-south problem. The data that's being collected by colleagues of mine who work on this around the world shows that, in fact, a lot of e-waste is now traveling around what we would call the global south. So this is becoming a very globalized issue, and I think in ways that we need to understand it better. But I think your other guest had that absolutely correctly, is that we need to have ways of reducing the toxic elements in e-waste. We need to make these different discarded electronics repairable. We need to make it easy to extract valuable elements. And in the US and other parts of the world, we're seeing a growing right to repair movement. And I think this really combats a lot of corporate power, the whole notion of planned obsolescence, that we just throw out our iPhone after 2 years because it doesn't work or we need a new one. That mentality is where we really have to focus our attention if we really want to solve the issue of e-waste and the global issue of e-waste.
Aisano, getting back to Malaysia, how did it become a place where people from around the world was dumping waste? Was there an economic incentive in the beginning? I mean, were both sides consenting to this waste being dumped when it started out?
No, I don't think it's quite, as you said, both sides consenting to it being dumped or in developing countries such as Malaysia. It's more like certain segments of unscrupulous traders or merchants, import agents. Well, they work together, as I said, with corrupt government officials and also those similar plastic agents from the West and from developed world. As a result, you have this sort of dumping in countries such as Malaysia. But I would also like to mention, as Kate has indicated just now, well, for example, developing countries themselves also produce a lot of waste, including plastic waste, and Malaysia is not immune from that. And to address that problem, number one, you need a widespread civic environmental education. You need, for example, to enable people to have incentives to not throw as much garbage. Instead, they could, as you mentioned, recycle this garbage, or even better, there are grassroots efforts in Malaysia, for example, to so-called upcycle some of this plastic and metal waste, so that they could be made into, for example, decorative items, which could be sold at higher prices. You need to have a monetary incentive for people to, for example, not throw away so much garbage. They should be able to improve their lives by means of a little bit of creativity to reuse or to upcycle some of those products into creative, artistic items.
Bridget, what are your thoughts on how this could be combated? Things like education or, as Aisano points out, upcycling?
Well, I think you also have to strengthen regulations. The Basel Convention that deals with issues of waste is actually being amended to deal with issues of plastics, for example, which is an international agreement. You also need domestic governments to strengthen their enforcement mechanisms and the laws in place. I think many of the laws have not kept up with what's actually happening on the ground. And so there needs to be a review of these and an assessments of what actually, and there needs to be studies more carefully of the environmental impacts of these things so that this can be part of the education process.
Talking about the Basel Convention, Bridget, the United States, that's a 30-year-old convention. The United States has not signed that.
No, 9 countries have not signed it, and the United States is one of them.
What is the objection?
Well, the United States doesn't want to be beholden to certain regulations internationally, and that trend is actually extended.
Dinyar, Godrej, what are your thoughts on international regulation of how waste moves around, how waste is produced, actually? Should there be more international enforceable rules for dumping? Do we need more to be done in poorer countries?
Well, that would be ideal, really, and of course we need more to be done in poorer countries as well. To return to the question of plastic, which is so pervasive, and of course it's plastic crosses the board against rich and poor worlds. But it's also, you need a policy response that begins at the start with the production of the material. Because, for example, a flimsy plastic bag which has an average, use, a single-use one, of, say, 15 minutes. Now, 2 million of those are being handed out all over the world every single minute, There's enough plastic being generated every year, which is equivalent to the weight of all the human beings on this planet. So no amount of upcycling or recycling is going to tackle that question head on. There has to be a policy response of reduction, really, because currently only 9% of plastic is being recycled. And let me tell you one more thing about plastic recycling, is that you don't get the same quality of the material again, so it is always downcycling. A plastic bottle won't make another plastic bottle, or not for long, it'll be a low quality version of it. So we have to find different ways. We have to encourage producers not to produce so much of this stuff, because a lot of it is just useless packaging.
But Kate, we are seeing some countries, developing countries, take the initiative. If you look at the Philippines, for instance, they used to take a lot of waste from Canada, but now, in fact, the Philippines are turning those ships around and saying, take it back to where it came from.
Yeah, I think that this is a great step that is being taken by countries in the global South. Philippines, the action is certainly quite dramatic. I will note that the waste is from 2013, so obviously it's been around for a while. But I think that a lot of the countries that are in Southeast Asia have also suffered very much from China's decision-making here. And I wouldn't say suffering directly, but to go back to why Malaysia was taking waste from 2013 is that 2013 was when China started cutting back and restricting plastic imports from the West. And what we're seeing there is kind of the magic of globalization. One market closes, another one opens. And I think that's something we're really struggling also to keep ahead of when we're looking at global regulation and other forms of ways of controlling this trade. But I do think that the history of waste trading is, and I've been studying this now since, around about 1989, has been one where there's been a lot more resistance from the South. And I feel like the Basel Convention has been really important in responding to this and supporting countries in making these decisions. And I just wanted to connect to another issue that I think has made this area of such great concern to the global community. And that is, of course, the issue of marine plastics and the way that our oceans are being polluted with all kinds of plastic waste.
Right.
And I think that's something that really has generated a lot of interest, as well as China's decision to restrict imports of plastic waste, and is a great way forward. It's like a lot of different actors think we need to do something about this problem because of the oceans, and that's generating quite a bit of interest.
Yeah.
It's also the one thing that the U.S. administration is embracing right now as a global environmental problem.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it. And before we go, though, another reminder about the Heats podcast. You can listen to some of our great content through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. The podcast covers similar global stories that we do here on the show, but it also includes some personal and candid interviews with our guests and correspondents. Just search CGTN and you'll find it. Thanks again for watching.